The reading of all the documents reveals that UFOs have the ability to render inoperable present-day technology. UFOs have the ability to gain access to our most sensitive military installations, unrestricted and unlimited access to nuclear installations.
There's no doubt about it in my mind that there's a government UFO.
Of course, we both knew differently. A retired lieutenant colonel says this on camera in September 1980, sitting for a television crew from In Search Of in his living room in Houma, Louisiana. He's not agitated. He's not selling anything. He's simply recounting July of 1947, standing next to a general, facing a room of reporters, under orders to keep quiet about what he actually thought the wreckage was after 2 days spent recovering it. He kept his mouth shut. The general called it a weather balloon and left it there. Then came that sentence. Knew what? Differently than what? A single line, spoken 30-some years after the fact, by a man who had nothing obvious left to gain from saying it, and it's the hinge this whole case turns on. To see why, you have to go back 13 years earlier, to a phone call in the desert. Roswell isn't just tabloid folklore. It's the origin point of modern American UFO belief, the case that every other case gets measured against. But most Roswell witnesses were second-hand. A nurse who heard something, a mortician who was told something, a rancher's neighbor who remembered something decades later. This case is different. At the center of it is one named Career Military Intelligence Officer with direct, physical, hands-on access to the debris. He was the man who drove out to the ranch. He was the man who loaded the wreckage into a vehicle. He was the man who flew with it to Texas and stood in the room where it got reclassified as a weather balloon. And more than 30 years later, under his own name, on television, in print, and in lecture halls, he began saying that explanation was false, and that he knew it was false the day it was issued. He never once walked that back, not for the rest of his life. Whether that consistency is the strongest piece of testimony Roswell has, or the most stubborn exaggeration in UFO history, is exactly what this case forces you to sit with. Monday, July 7, 1947. Roswell Army Airfield takes a call from Sheriff George Wilcox. A local rancher, he says, has recovered a crashed flying disc on his property. It's an odd thing to report, and an odder thing to believe. But 2 weeks earlier, a civilian pilot's account of strange objects in the sky over Washington state had been picked up by newspapers across the country, and by early July, sightings of so-called flying saucers were being reported nationwide. Wilcox's call lands in exactly that atmosphere. The rancher's name is W. Mac Brazel. Weeks earlier, out on the property he worked near Corona, New Mexico, Brazel had come across wreckage scattered across a wide stretch of pasture. Foil, rubber, sticks, tape. Nothing about it screamed spacecraft, but it was strange enough and widespread enough that Brazel eventually made the drive into town to tell the sheriff about it. The officer who gets sent to look into it is Major Jesse Antoine Marcel Sr., the head intelligence officer at Roswell Army Airfield. He is not some green desk clerk. Marcel is 40 years old, a World War II veteran who flew combat missions with the 5th Bomber Command in the Southwest Pacific and came home with 2 air medals and a Bronze Star. The year before Roswell, he'd helped run intelligence for Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll, and received formal letters of commendation from 2 different generals for his work there, including one from Brigadier General Roger Ramey. That name will come back. This is the man who gets the call. Marcel doesn't go alone. He's joined by Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Cavett, another intelligence officer at the base. The 2 of them meet Brazel and follow him out to the ranch. Marcel in a jeep, Brazel and Cavett on horseback. Remember that detail. 2 officers, 1 ranch, 1 afternoon of debris. Decades later, what they each say about that afternoon will not match. At the site, the 3 men gather what they can. Marcel later described a wide, thin debris field, foil-like material, sticks resembling balsa wood, sections that wouldn't tear or burn the way ordinary materials should. They load as much as the jeep can carry and head back to base. It's an unremarkable end to what will become, in hindsight, one of the most argued over afternoons of the 20th century. Back at Roswell Army Airfield, Marcel reports what he's found to the base commander, Colonel William H. Blanchard. What happens next moves fast, arguably too fast. Blanchard authorizes a press release. It goes out on July 8, 1947, announcing the recovery of a flying disc, and it names Marcel as the officer responsible for it, a career intelligence officer, in a press release, tied by name to a flying saucer. That alone should tell you how seriously the base was initially treating this. The debris is loaded onto a plane, and Marcel flies with it to Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, the same base commanded by Brigadier General Roger Ramey, the man who'd praised Marcel's work at Bikini less than a year earlier. At Fort Worth, a press conference is held. The material on the table is identified as pieces of a weather balloon and its radar target, a balloon kite, the newspapers call it. Marcel is quoted the next day in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, describing hours spent combing the site for more debris and finding little beyond tinfoil and rubber. Here's the part worth sitting with. In July of 1947, on the record, Marcel's own words support the balloon explanation. That's not a footnote. That's the foundation everything after it has to explain. Also present for the Fort Worth photographs is Colonel Thomas Dubose, another officer who poses with the debris for the cameras that day. He doesn't say much publicly in 1947. He will, much later. Keep his name in mind. He becomes one of the most important figures in this story, 44 years from now. Then, almost nothing. The Roswell story fades. It doesn't become a cultural phenomenon in 1947. It becomes a forgotten local incident, a one-week news cycle. For 3 decades, Jesse Marcel says essentially nothing more about it in public. That silence ends in 1978, when a tabloid reprints the uncorrected original Roswell headline from July 8, 1947, the one calling it a flying disc, not a balloon. That same year, in February, retired Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Marcel is tracked down and interviewed by ufologist Stanton Friedman. And here, the story changes. Marcel tells Friedman he believes the debris recovered at Roswell was extraterrestrial. This is the moment the modern Roswell mythology is actually born, not in 1947, but in a 1978 phone call, more than 30 years after the fact. That's your first rehook. A story that was publicly closed for 30 years gets reopened by the very man who closed it. The story doesn't stay quiet for long. On December 19, 1979, Marcel is interviewed again, this time by Bob Pratt of the National Enquirer. By February of 1980, the tabloid runs the story at full volume, and Roswell moves from a regional footnote into national UFO folklore for good. Which brings us back to where we started. On September 20th, 1980, the television series In Search Of airs its interview with Marcel. He describes, on camera, being told to stay quiet in 1947, while Ramey gave reporters the weather balloon line. And then, of course, we both knew differently. It's worth being honest about what that sentence is and isn't. It is not new physical evidence. It's a claim, a memory, decades old, about what was privately understood in a room in 1947. Whether it's accurate is exactly the question the rest of this case has to wrestle with. Marcel wasn't the only member of his household with a story to tell. His son, Jesse Marcel Jr., was 10 years old in July of 1947, and for the next 35 years he maintained that his father brought debris home that night and spread it across the kitchen floor for the family to see, describing, among the pieces, a small beam marked with purple-hued symbols. In 2007, by then a physician, Marcel Jr. published his own account, The Roswell Legacy, describing his father's excitement that night and his conviction that what he'd found was, in his words, not of this earth. Marcel Jr. held to that account until his death in 2013. That's 2 generations of the same family, telling versions of the same story, for over 3 decades, without either of them changing course. Because the clean version of this story, decorated officer sees something extraordinary, gets silenced, spends 30 years quietly building the courage to tell the truth, runs into a problem. And it's a problem that comes from inside the case file, not from outside it. In December of 1995, researcher Robert Todd published a skeptical examination of Marcel's record, bluntly titled Major Jesse Marcel, Folk Hero or Mythomaniac. According to accounts of Marcel's military personnel file, at least one evaluation on record noted a tendency to exaggerate, and Sheridan Cavett, the same officer who rode out to the ranch alongside Marcel in 1947, later recalled the debris field as unremarkable. Nothing unusual in his account. Cavett said he didn't even think it warranted filing a report. 2 men, 1 jeep ride, 2 completely different stories about what they found, and neither of them ever changed his account for the rest of his life. But the exaggerator theory has its own problem, and it surfaced when researchers got hold of Marcel's full service record in the mid-1990s. If Marcel really had bungled the identification, misled his commander, and embarrassed the Army Air Force on a national stage, you'd expect that to show up somewhere in his file afterward. It doesn't. Blanchard, his direct commanding officer, and the man most exposed by the flying disc press release, rated Marcel's post-Roswell performance as superior, recommended him for promotion, and Marcel did in fact make lieutenant colonel in the reserves that December. Whatever happened at that ranch, it didn't cost him his career, and the officer most positioned to punish him for a mistake did the opposite. So which is it? A man with a documented reputation for embellishment, or a man whose superiors kept vouching for him right after the incident that supposedly proved he couldn't be trusted? The honest answer is, the record supports both readings, and neither side of this case gets to declare victory on this point alone. The official explanation, when it finally came, wasn't a weather balloon at all. In 1994, in response to a congressional inquiry, the Air Force produced a report, later expanded into the 1995 Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, concluding that the material Marcel recovered most likely came from Project Mogul, a then-classified program using high-altitude balloon arrays to listen for Soviet nuclear tests. Air Force Declassification Officer Lieutenant James McAndrew put it plainly, nobody at Roswell had a need to know about Mogul, so nobody there could have correctly identified what they were looking at. That gap, he argued, is what let rumor fill in the blanks for the next 50 years. It's a tidy explanation. It also arrives 47 years after the fact, from the same institution that issued the original cover story, which is exactly why plenty of researchers and Marcel's own family never fully accepted it. Which brings us to the single most consequential piece of testimony in this entire case, and it doesn't come from Marcel at all. In 1991, retired Air Force Brigadier General Thomas Dubose, the same officer who'd posed for the Fort Worth debris photographs back in 1947, went on record and acknowledged something extraordinary. The weather balloon explanation, Dubose said, was a cover story to divert the attention of the press. Read that again. That's not a UFO researcher. That's not a tabloid reporter. That's a general who was physically present at the press conference where the balloon explanation was issued, admitting more than 4 decades later that it was constructed to redirect journalists, not necessarily to conceal aliens, but to conceal something. Dubose never said what. He didn't have to. His admission did what 30 years of Marcel's testimony alone couldn't. It corroborated, from a second, independent, uninterested source, that the public explanation handed to the press in July 1947 was not the whole truth being held internally. Whatever we both knew differently meant when Marcel said it in 1980, Dubose's statement is the closest thing this case has to outside confirmation that a version was being managed. Jesse Marcel died on June 23, 1986, in Houma, Louisiana, at 79 years old. In his final years, by several accounts, he made his living as a self-employed television repairman, a small, almost unbearably ordinary detail for a man who'd spent his last decade telling the world he'd once held pieces of something not of this earth. He never recanted. Not to Friedman in 1978, not to Pratt in 1979, not on camera in 1980, not in any interview or lecture in the years after. Whatever he believed by the end, he believed it consistently, in public, under his own name, for the rest of his life. The story didn't end with him, either. In 2020, a diary reportedly kept by Marcel around the time of the incident surfaced in the hands of his grandchildren, Jesse Marcel III, Denise Marcel, and John Marcel, and became the centerpiece of a History Channel documentary reinvestigating the case. More than 70 years on, the family is still turning over new pages, looking for the same thing the rest of us are. So, go back to that Louisiana living room in 1980. The cameras rolling, the retired officer choosing his words carefully. Of course, we both knew differently. Differently from what the press was told. Differently, maybe, from what even he was allowed to say. He took that distinction to his grave, and he never once blinked on it in public. Whether that makes him the most consistent witness in UFO history, or simply a man who told the same story so many times he came to believe it completely, that's the question Roswell still hasn't answered. Maybe it's the question it was never going to.